it was a box office flop.
Wow.
Bankrupted his company. Years later in re-release, that Christmas, people started watching it and it caught on in the early 80s and it became like beloved. And
Get Out.
And
okay, I didn't know that. It was really because it started in the 80s,
yes.
the love for this movie?
Yep.
Life is like a roller coaster, but it's so much better when we go through it together. Welcome to the Candace Cameron Bure Podcast. My guest co-host for this special series is Andy Erwin from Kingdom Story Company and host of the Storytellers Podcast. And we are talking about your favorite movies and the stories behind them. Come join us. Andy, we are like moving into this genre that I've kind of become known for, which is so crazy to me. We're moving into some Christmas movies, and we're also coming to a close on our series.
Sad. It's been fun.
This week and next week, but we're gonna be talking about some Christmas movies, and this one is a Christmas classic.
I know, it's great, and the Christmas movies, you kind of have a PhD in that because it's like. Wait, like, what is it about Christmas movies that you love so much? Like, what is it that, it was Christmas your season growing up, or is it just?
No, I mean, honestly, the fact that I've done so many Christmas movies, that's the way the cards fell for me. It was like my first Hallmark movie that I had done was a Christmas movie, and it just kind of took off. But of course, I love Christmas movies. I always have, but I never set out to be like, I want to make a million Christmas movies.
It's like Groundhog Day. That's great.
Yeah, but I do love them because to me, Christmas movies are ones that you want to watch over and over again. Most of them are classics, and then you look forward to them that one time of year to re-watch them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's something that you watch as a tradition. And so this one, when we went through our list of films, we each had kind of our favorites that we picked. This one was a gimme for me because this one was like, this is on my top 3 films of any film that I love. So yeah, this one's really powerful for me. And so you gave this one to me and I was like, I want to run with it. So it's A Wonderful Life, Frank Capra's classic with Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
And I remember there was this old timey theater in Birmingham, Alabama, where I grew up. It was called the Alabama Theater. It was built in the 1930s, I think, by Paramount, and it houses like 3,000 people. It turned out it's where my grandparents had their first date. Like a lot of history there.
So sweet.
It was beautiful, and it was where I took Mandy on our first date. So there's like a lot of history in that building.
I love it.
But every Christmas we would get together, and they would show It's a Wonderful Life for like a sellout crowd. It was hard to get tickets to.
Wow.
And watching it with a crowd of 3,000 people and watching them experience something they've seen over and over again, and just the nostalgia in that room, it was palpable. It was powerful.
Wow.
And, it's a story that you look at it now and it's listed as one of the best films of all time. It's definitely one of the best holiday films of all time. It's a perennial. The thing people don't know about it is it was born out of tons of failure.
Really?
Yeah. So
I would love to know some of the history of this movie.
So it was a short story by this failed writer that couldn't get anything published. He used to do it it was a bedtime story he would tell his daughter, and they would sit around and make up stories about George Bailey in this imaginary town of Bedford Falls. And he couldn't get anybody to publish it. And so they were sending these little booklets over to the war, and he was a bookbinder that's by trade, struggling to feed his family. So he, on a whim, bound it up and sent it as a book over to the troops to read in World War II. And there was a filmmaker named Frank Capra, who's everything that I do on a DNA level as a filmmaker goes back to Frank Capra.
Wow.
He was this Sicilian immigrant, but his movies were all about hope and optimism.
Yeah.
And he was ridiculed in his day a lot of times because he was too optimistic. But there's something beautiful and timeless about the stories he told. And he was over documenting World War II, going through a really stressful experience. And then his star of a lot of his films, he'd worked a lot with Jimmy Stewart. And Jimmy Stewart was like the Tom Hanks of his day.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Stewart was fighting for the U.S. He was fighting for the Air Force, the Army Air Corps. He had a lot of post-traumatic stress. So these men came home, and this story finds them on the front lines, and he reads it. And he's like, this is my next movie. I have to make this movie. comes home to make the movie, and in it, they spent way too much money, and it was a box office flop.
Wow.
Bankrupted his company.
No way.
And just was considered like a tragic flop. But years later,
was it not well received by the audience either?
It just didn't make enough money.
Okay.
It wasn't that they hated it. It's just, it just didn't work.
Right.
Because so much about a film is about timing.
Yeah.
But years later in re-release, at Christmas, people started watching it and it caught on in the early 80s and it became like beloved. And
Get Out.
And that's,
okay, I didn't know that. It was really because it started in the 80s,
Yes.
the love for this movie?
Yep. So in watching it, and as it began to be re-released at Christmas, people started watching it as part of their holiday tradition, and it became a Christmas beloved classic.
Wow.
So it was out of failure. And so like some of the most timeless stories are the ones that don't work when they're released, but time tells what's a great story. And
now,
so
you kind of mentioned one movie earlier in the season that, can I say it was a failure for you?
It was.
I mean, do you relate in that way?
Oh, yeah. I think that's why I love this movie.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that and talk about the movie.
Well, so it was a movie called Woodlawn, and we talked about it in an earlier episode. But Woodlawn was one that, you know, my brother and I had chased our entire career. It was something we heard as a bedtime story from our father. It was a true story, happened during the last part of integration in Birmingham, Alabama, dealt with a lot of racial tension. And then the Jesus movement that we highlighted in the Jesus Revolution hit this town and this school and led to the emergence of the first black superstar out of that school system, this kid named Tony Nathan. So it's a sequel. Jesus Revolution was a prequel to this. We actually end the whole movie with the Jesus Revolution Time magazine cover.
Oh, interesting.
So the desire to go back and do Jesus Revolution came out of this movie. So it was the thing that we were like, this is the movie that's going to put us on the map. This is the one that's the most important one for us to do. We told the story, and I'm still incredibly proud of the final product. But when it was released, it just, for whatever reason, same as It's a Wonderful Life, timing. It wasn't connected to a book or something that people knew. It was this kind of original story that kind of got forgotten. And we had spent way too much money. It almost bankrupted our company. And we had spent way too, it's the only thing that I've ever done that's still in the red.
Wow.
And I remember being done with that and being like, God, this is it. I don't know if maybe I need to find another job. And it was a humbling experience. But in that moment, that's where we found our voice. That's why we tell true stories now. That's why we tell stories of hope and underdog stories. And people said, go once more around the block and find your story. And that's where we found I Can Only Imagine. And every bit of I Can Only Imagine came out of Woodlawn. And
what was the biggest lesson that you learned from the failure of that movie? Failure in terms of box office, because
it still had a huge impact. So Woodlawn, we put a 1-800 number at the end for people that wanted to talk about faith, and it got over 400,000 calls around the world. So so like eternal things
made its impact. Yes.
But as far as like industry success, it was considered a failure. And so I think for me,
like, what was your George Bailey moment at the end?
The George Bailey moment is, good question. I like that. That's good. George Bailey moment. So George Bailey's moment at the end of It's a Wonderful Life is all about perspective. He wanted to be a big deal and he wanted to go see the world. But instead, he found out that he was truly important. And the importance was about the people he had impacted along the way. And so it was about perspective. And I think for me in Woodlawn, as an artist in an industry that's very insecure, you wear your heart on your sleeve a lot. And you sometimes are this like, don't criticize my work because you criticize me. And you just like, my value is in what I do. And I think in that, all that got stripped away. And it's like, if I've got none of this, am I still valuable to God? And I think in that, there's this stillness of surrender and of saying, okay, God, you know, instead of me doing this for me anymore, it's too hard. I'm tired. I quit. What do you want to do? And I think that was the question I started asking. I stopped saying, God bless what I'm doing. And I started asking, God, what do you want to do? And in that,
I love that,
God began to direct our steps. And I think that was carved out of the humility that came from that. So that was kind of ours. Has there ever been failures in your journey that have kind of fueled your growth, or are you finding your voice in any ways?
I mean, I've certainly had, there's lots of business failures, ones that nobody would really know about from a public perspective. But and the thing that failure in the moment really stinks. Nobody loves failure, but you learn so much from it.
Yes.
Because it also, you can learn the little things of like what actually went wrong, what are new steps I can take the next time. But it also causes you to ask yourself the big questions, just like you said, who am I doing this for? Am I doing it for myself, or I'm doing it for God? So failures in that way are really great, but you can't really appreciate them until you're a step ahead, and then you look back in retrospect and you're kind of like, okay, Lord, thanks. I get it. Now I see it, and you appreciate it. So I'm always thankful for my failures in that way, because it means real and true growth. Yeah. But failures stink when you're going through them.
They do.
In the moment.
They do. So, and I think a lot of times people have a perspective too, because we see this like little bits into people's life, and we kind of assume that everything that has always worked for them. You know, if I look at your life, I'm like, that's Candace Cameron Bure. Like, she's obviously always had it together, and she has been an uber success, and it's just always been, you know, perfection. But once you kind of get the inside scoop of like the hills and the valleys that go with that, it's so different. And so with George Bailey's life, this idea of It's a Wonderful Life is heaven's perspective on a man's life. You know, to see these little moments that, as Clarence the angel is watching his life unfold, these are the moments that made the person. And George always had all this ambition, and he wanted to go out and just see the world and be a big deal. And it seemed like every time he kind of tried to step into that, his way got blocked, until in the moment of his most desperate moment, he feels like, what would the world be like without me? And I'm not needed. And then all of a sudden he sees heaven's perspective, that he actually had a truly important life. And I think sometimes, you know, I was talking with a counselor the other day. I very, very much recommend counseling, especially if you're going to be in this business. But I was talking with a counselor the other day, and she was like, Andy, what about if you never get the recognition that you think you're owed, and people don't know what you did, and people won't know it until they get to heaven? Is that okay? And I wrestled with that. And I was like, I want it to be okay. But I don't know. And sometimes you won't ever see truly heaven's perspective on that, like the amount of people's lives that were changed along the way that you just didn't know. So have you ever had moments like for you that have kind of brought perspective to what's really important in this job?
I mean, listen, I can think about what you just said outside of entertainment, because especially when I was a full-time stay-at-home mom for those 10 years.
Talk about unseen.
Talk about unseen, which is very much what Unsung Hero was a lot about too. It's all the things that you're doing on a daily basis for your family that go unappreciated. Or you're just not getting a pat on the back and be like, hey, your dishwashing was awesome today. Thanks for that laundry, Mom. I'm glad you changed my diaper. Thanks. You know, obviously we're not getting that from our family. So those types of things are, you know, can just feel like, what am I doing with my life? And it's hard. What am I doing with my life in the sense that, you don't feel appreciated. And it's like, is this what my value is all about? Is this what I'm really worth? Am I really, is this important stuff? And so that for me was a wrestle at times. And then, you know, it's a hard question, what you said. If I never got recognized for anything that I did, would I be okay with that if God is the only one? And I think I'm in the same position in that I'm like, I want to be okay with that, but that kind of hurts a little bit. I think about even this podcast, because I'll tell you, I really enjoyed this podcast. I didn't intentionally set out like, oh, I'm just dying to do a podcast, but recognized it as a way in which I could do ministry for people and share Jesus with people. So I'm like, okay, let's do a podcast, but it's not like the number one thing. Like, I can't wait. Yeah. No, I want to go like make a movie. That's what I want to go do. But podcast, I'm like, hey, this is a great avenue for ministry. So let's do it. And the amount of feedback that we get, all of you guys that write your questions into the website, that all of the comments on YouTube and all of the platforms, they mean so much to me. They fuel me and my desire. But if you ask me right now, well, what if you did this podcast, Candace, but you never heard from one person?
Wow.
Like nobody ever commented back. Would you still do the podcast?
Well,
and I don't know what that answer would be right now. Like that's a hard question to wrestle with because we all want to feel seen and like what we're doing in our life is important and it's making a difference, even if it's for one person.
Yeah.
So that it's a great question.
I wrestle with it too. And I think that's why this movie impacts me so much because it does present that wrestling match of the desire of what I want and the desire of what I'm called to and how there's a tension in between those two things. And, you know, and also sometimes this is a matter of timing. You know, I've gone through a season with my career where I was part of a duo for a long time, and John and I do, you know, a lot of different things now. And so John's got things he's chasing, things I'm chasing, you know, and we afforded the ability to do that. But I think as we kind of, you know, grew and tried things, God called me to a season where he's like, with what you guys are feeling called to kingdom, ultimately, we're like kingdom, we wanted to be a platform where we empowered other storytellers. And for a while, that was the John and Andy show, where we were doing our movies. But there came a point that the only way for us to grow was for us to step out of the way and intentionally recruit and push people in front of the spotlight.
Yeah.
So for the past 3 years, I moved over to more producing, and my job was to find people that I believed in their story and push them out in front of it. So we just did that. You and I just were able to do that with Unsung Hero. Our job was to really empower a story and push Joel and Richie out in front and allow them to take a bow. But there's the thanklessness to that sometime where you're just like, you're in the background. Yeah. And it's a new thing. And so I've had to wrestle with, if people don't know what you contributed, is that okay? And that's a constant growing thing for me to be like, heaven's perspective, God knows what I'm doing and why I'm doing it.
Totally. And that's where it comes back to that audience of one.
Yep.
And it's something that goes through my mind all the time. Who are you doing it for at the end of the day? And I have to remember that really my audience is an audience of one. It's God.
Yep.
And will I stand before him and say, be okay with like, you saw me? Because he does see us. He sees every single thing. I mean, he knows the thoughts in our mind. And am I okay with that? And there's a lot of times I am okay with it, but I think if pressed on certain things, I think I would probably be like Peter in the Bible. And I'd be like, there's no way I'm going to deny you, God. Yeah, God, I love you. I love you. And then like, oh my gosh, Candace, you just denied it.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I probably would be like that if I'm going to be really honest today. And I don't want to be like that.
Yep.
But
it's that wrestling match with that the human part of you that I'm like you. I'm a recovering people pleaser.
Yeah.
I want people to I don't really want praise. I don't crave praise.
Yeah.
I do crave people pat me on the back, being like,
good job.
Like, thank you. Good job. You did great.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden,
it's my love language, man.
No.
It's like words of affirmation.
Yeah.
Good job, Candace. Yeah. It's not the praise, but it's the like, yeah.
Well, good job, Candace.
Good job, Andy.
Thank you. Oh man, I feel seen. The other thing I love about this film is I feel like it's one of my favorite prayers ever on film. There's a prayer in the bar by George Bailey when he's at his lowest point. And it's the most honest prayer I think that has ever been on film. Jimmy Stewart poured what he had gone through in World War II into that moment. Like he was struggling a lot with post-traumatic stress and he was on set. And when he went to that moment, he just had a real breakdown and was having a hard time with flashbacks and just uttered this really sincere prayer. It was one take. And Frank Capra.
That wasn't scripted?
There was scripted that George Bailey says a prayer, but it wasn't scripted to be like that.
Wow.
And it was one take, and it was so beautiful that Frank Capra couldn't recapture it on a close up. So they actually punch in the shot to be a punched in close up. So you notice that it's the one shot in that sequence that's grainier than all the rest. It's because they punched in to be able to see all the emotion on his face. It was something so beautiful. But the prayer, the way it read, it's very simple. It's this: Dear Father in heaven, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way. Please show me the way. And there's just something about just a prayer at your lowest moment, for help.
Yeah.
And for you, your moments of sincerity, your connection with God, where do the most sincere moments of prayer come from in your journey, like with the Lord, where you feel like you get it down to that childlike, like, I just need you help? Like, what are those moments that you can remember where that's been the cry of your heart?
This is where I get teary. Hold on. I feel it. I feel the tears coming to my nose, but I'm pushing them back. I'm pushing back because it's out of such love. I love God so much. I love how kind and faithful he is. I remember my very first prayer when I really understood the gospel, and I was about 22 or 23 years old. Again, been a Christian since I was 12. But when that moment came, like the veil was lifted and I understood God's love for me from not a place of my doing, but God just loves me because he loves me. My prayer was out of gratitude. And I asked him, I said, please don't let this fire let me not forget what this feels like. Let me not forget who you are. And I pray that you will keep a fire burning inside of me to continue to love you and tell people who you are and how great you are and how much you love them. And it was the word fire. And we hear that saying like, oh, that Christian's on fire. They're on fire for the Lord. And sometimes it sounds really cheesy, but God has lit a flame under me that morning, because literally it was like the lights turned on. It was powered up, and I've prayed that prayer consistently. And so I can look back, and I'm now 48 years old, but I was praying that prayer at 22, and I'm like, I'm pretty bold in my faith. Wow. I don't think that fire's ever dimmed, Wow. There may have been seasons I've been discouraged and been down, but God has been so faithful that I surprise myself at sometimes how passionate and bold I am for the Lord. And I'm just like, I love him, God. And I prayed this, and you have been faithful to just keep the flame burning in me. That's amazing. That gave me chills. What about you? For me, there's been moments, and I think, somebody said that, a good acronym for God is a gift of desperation. It's like when you really need him, where you don't have anything else to cling to. You don't have anything else to be able to point to and say, this is why I'm qualified for you to pick me. Yeah. And in that moment, God's like, I pick you. And, there's been several of those moments, I think, where God takes you back to a place where you believed a lie. It takes you back to a place where you really need to depend on him. For me, it really came in my early 20s, and I had really struggled and walked away from the Lord, and I wasn't married, but I really had gone through a dark season of about probably 10 months to a year, where I just was really not walking with God, and I worked on the road a good bit at the time. Working in television as a cameraman, and traveled a lot, and just was not walking with the Lord. Yeah. And I just kind of came to a place where I just had fallen on my face so much that I just was kind of at my wit's end. I was like, I can't do this anymore, and I feel like giving up. And the moment where God brought me to the realization, I was in a hallway. And it was in Phoenix,
Arizona, and I was at the airport, and I was like, God, I know this place. Where am I? And it turned out it was a hallway where this girl that I thought was a girl that I was going to get serious with, that she had broken up with me at that place. And he said, son, this is where, several years ago, you stopped believing that I really cared about you and that I really loved you. Mm-hmm. And he's like, son, it's time to stop believing that lie. And God had taken me back to that place of where I believed the lie in order to reclaim the truth. Mm. And I just broke down in tears. I went in the bathroom. I was like trying to catch my breath.
Yeah.
But God took me back to that place of desperation and that place of failure, to where he's like, that's not who you are. And it's in that, then God gave me a whole new walk with him, and ultimately brought my beautiful wife, Mandy, into my life. That was absolutely the one that he was preparing me for. Yeah. And gave me 3 beautiful kids. And I've been married for 17 years. But it was that moment of failure where I was ready to just throw in the towel. I was like, I quit. And he's like, that's the point. Quit.
Yeah.
And so that's to me, the most sincere prayers come at that dark night of the soul, where it's like, I have no choice but to cling to you. I need you. So for me,
that's
it
so
all kind of came out of that moment.
That's
Phoenix,
so
Arizona.
beautiful. Oh my goodness. If you guys are listening, we want to know what your George Bailey moment is. So would you please, you could write it in the comments. You could, whether that's on YouTube or in the comments on our social channels, or if it feels very personal, send us an email at candace.com. And we don't have to read it out loud to anybody, but we would love to know. And I think it is an incredible expression for you to think about at home. What is my George Bailey moment? What is the prayer? Where is the place where God really met me? And just speak it out loud and remind yourself of that moment, and remember who God is, especially if you're in a place right now where you're struggling to know if God sees you. He does. And tell us where he's met you before, or where he has met you right now. So, wow, this is a good one. I think we're going to go to a listener question right now.
Let's do it.
Here's our question. Has there been a moment in your life where God has let you take a step back and see heaven's perspective? A moment of impact that you didn't know what happened, or a moment that has made the struggle worth it? Ooh, okay. I can answer this right now. So I feel like I get little glimpses of heaven when you guys write in. Truly. And sometimes that's in my DMs on on Instagram or on my socials, because that's the place of impact. Most of you who are watching and listening, I'll probably never meet. I mean, I hope that we have an exchange at some time or another, but we might not meet until we're in heaven. Yeah. And I get these incredible messages from people that are such an encouragement to me, that will say, you don't realize what this podcast has meant to me, or your guest that you had on spoke these words and they were powerful. It's changed my walk with the Lord. Any way that to just know the little glimpses that we are impacting people for the kingdom and for Jesus is such a glimpse of heaven to me.
I know.
And I'm just like, whoa, especially when I don't know you, I can't see you, I may never meet you. And yet I've somehow put a little thumbprint on your life in some special way. That is so cool to me.
That's amazing. I love that. I think for me, it's very similar. When we did the movie Jesus Revolution, my brother and Brent McCorkle did that movie. The thing
incredible
that
movie,
never
by
got
the way.
old, it's really on them. But the thing that never got old was when we would run into somebody in their 70s that was part of that hippie movement, and then to cry and kind of tear up and be like, you took me right back there to that revival. That's exactly how it felt. And when we would hear stories like that, and you'd see the old guard feeling young again, and remembering the fire that they had back in the original days.
Yeah.
Like, that was always an honor and a privilege to just remind them, like, this is what you lived.
Yeah.
And so that's the power of true stories. And that's what never gets old.
I love that. All right. We have another question, and this person does want to stay anonymous. They said, what advice do you have for someone who has not experienced any sort of miracle or aha moment when it comes to God? I very much am a see to believe person, and I'm always looking for answers. Am I looking too hard? Will he show up when I'm not looking? I'm a stay-at-home mom of 2 with no real career path. I am living very simply, but I very much want big things to happen for my family, and I just don't know in what way. I feel like this season of my life is fine, and I'm grateful, and I'm trying to fulfill it, but will there be more? Well, I know that we talked a lot about this in my season with Bianca Olthoff. And I too, I think I've had a couple of what I would now consider for me some aha moments in my life, but I've never seen a vision. And I've talked to people on this podcast who've seen a vision or heard God speak to them.
Right.
And I'm like, I've always wanted those moments in my life. And I haven't had those experiences. And for me, I really look for God in the little things in life.
Yeah.
Bianca will tell you, no, go for the big things, pray for the big things because God will show up and answer you. I love her spirit. But I think that there's so much power in the small things in life.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't think it's that we're necessarily looking too hard for them, but we just might not be focused on the right things. Yeah. We might not be looking in the right direction. So my encouragement to you would be to, pray specifically for sure, because, God answers prayers specifically. And remember that God can answer with a yes, a no, or a wait. Yeah. That's an answer.
Yep.
But I would also very much encourage you to pray for what God wants you to see in him.
Yeah.
Instead of always like, this is what I need to prove to me that you are real or doing something in my family.
Totally.
Pray for the openness of like, God, how is it that you want to move in my family? And will you show me what that is?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think what I would just say is she's, what a beautiful question, a vulnerable question. The desire there is a beautiful thing. And I just encourage her that she is seeing miracles. She's got 2 little ones in front of her that are miracles.
Yeah.
And sometimes, in that thankless task that we talked about earlier about not feeling seen and doing something so important, God's granted her with 2 miracles to raise. And there's something so beautiful in that. I think just like the George Bailey thing, if you won't know how you could have changed the world until you get to heaven's perspective of who knows what God's going to do through her own kids.
Yeah.
So keep being faithful with where you're at. Yeah. Because those are the people that really influence and impact eternity.
Such a fitting answer and fitting for our movie today. And just remember too, because the Bible tells us that like when we maybe sway someone to the Lord or when we impact someone for kingdom purposes, the angels in heaven rejoice. Yes. They're having a party up there. Yep. So you might not feel like you're doing much, you're not seeing God, but when you're even with your children, you are making an imprint and an impact for God. The angels are having a party for you.
I love that. That's so good. That's so
Remember the celebration.
That's awesome.
Well, I hope that's an encouragement to you. And thank you for stopping by this week. We can't wait. Next week is our final episode. And it's going to be a good one. Remember that Andy and I have a family entertainment guide for you. If you ever find yourself just kind of watching movies or shows mindlessly, these are some questions and ideas to help you go a little bit deeper and understand what's really going on in the stories. You can go to Candace.com to find a link, and it's also in our show notes. Until next time, be grateful all day, every day. CandyRock Entertainment, all rights reserved.